So this is chapter 10. We're going to talk about the muscular system. Now, in this chapter, we are not going to look at all the individual muscles. So the vast majority of this chapter is not covered in this course. So the first thing we have to look at in skeletal muscles is, what do muscles do? And they do four things. One is they're the prime movers. They provide the major force for producing this specific movement. So, for instance, the prime mover of elbow flexion is a muscle called brachialis. It runs from the anterior portion of the humerus to the proximal end of the ulna, and it causes flexion of the elbow. It provides the most force for bending your elbow, and it only acts on those two bones. The antagonists are the muscles that oppose that force. So in the case of elbow flexion, the antagonist would be the triceps muscle. The triceps muscle extends the elbow, so it resists the flexion of elbow. And we use the antagonist to control by eccentrically contracting the antagonist while we concentrically contract the prime mover. We get a controlled movement of, in this case, elbow flexion. Now, there's a couple more things. One of the other things is muscles that help the prime mover, and these are called synergists. So they add force. They modify the movement a little bit, but for the most part, they add force. So in the case of elbow flexion, the biceps brachii is what is the synergist. It goes from the scapula down to the radius. And by moving the radius into flexion, it helps move the ulna into flexion, and therefore helps with the flexion of elbow. Now, it will also end up supinating the forearm, and it will flex the shoulder joint because it crosses the shoulder joint, and the radius has a rotation movement. So the biceps adds those movements. Now, to flex your elbow, you don't want to also flex your shoulder at the same time. So we use other muscles like the rotator cuff muscles to prevent movements at the origin. And we call these muscles fixators. So when you flex your elbow, when you bring a drink to your lips, you're using brachialis as the prime mover. You're using biceps as a synergist. You're using the rotator cuff of your shoulder as a fixator, and you're using your triceps as the antagonist. And the amount of force that each one of those things adds to the movement in the direction that it adds it results in a controlled, smooth, synchronous movement. And all these movements, every movement has this list of muscles that are involved with it. Now, when they were naming skeletal muscles, they tried to make it easy. And there's a logic to naming muscles. So you don't have to make up names for muscles, but you have to recognize the names of muscles that are already pre-made up. So there are muscles that get named for where you find them. So one of the ways we name them is location. So your bum is called your gluteal region. So we have a big muscle there called the gluteus maximus. We have a small muscle there called the gluteus minimus. And we have a medium-sized muscle there that's called the gluteus medius. It's in the middle. We have a muscle in the rotator cuff called supraspinatus because it happens to be in the supraspinous fossa of the scapula. Things like that. So location is a big thing. Abdominis. So muscles in the abdomen are abdominis. So rectus abdominis, transversus abdominis, abdominis obliques, all happen in the abdomen. Sometimes we identify muscles by shape. So the deltoid is the shape of the letter delta, which is a triangular shape. Soleus looks like a fillet of sole. So that's the shape. Quadratus is four-sided. So pronator quadratus is a four-sided muscle. Trapezius looks like a trapezoid. So it's the shape. We can talk about relative size. So big muscles might be maximus, minimus. Long muscles are longus. Short muscles are brevis. Now, generally speaking, we only use the relative size when there's more than one muscle named for the same thing. So, for instance, the lateral side of your knee or of your leg is the peroneal region. So we have peroneus longus and peroneus brevis, the long one and the short one in that area. Sometimes they're called fibularis longus and brevis because it's along the fibula. We gluteus maximus, gluteus minimus we talked about. The kind of the trick is if there's a gluteus maximus, you know there's going to be a minimus. If there's a longus, you know there's going to be a brevis. Now, sometimes we name for the directions of fibers, and you're already starting to see that we mix these. We usually use 2 or 3 of these naming criteria. So rectus means straight up and down. So rectus, so your rectum runs straight up and down. Rectus abdominis is the one that runs straight up and down in the abdomen. Rectus femoris is the one that runs straight up and down in front of your femur. Things like that. Transversus means it runs horizontally. So there's a transversus thoracis, transversus abdominis. Oblique runs at an angle. So external obliques, internal obliques. Sometimes we talk about the number of origins. So if there's 2 origins, bicep. Sep means head. Tricep, 3 origins. Quadriceps, 4 origins. The best ones are when we talk about the location of the attachments and or the actions. So location of attachments. So the sternocleidomastoid starts on the sternum and the clavicle and inserts on the mastoid process of the skull. Action is a big one. So extensor digiti minimi extends your little finger. It's the one you use when you drink tea. Flexor halus longus is the long one that flexes your big toe. Pronator teres is the cylindrical one. Teres means cylindrical. So it's the cylindrical one that pronates your forearm. Pronator quadratus is the 4-sided one that pronates your forearm. The muscle that supinates your forearm is called supinator, named after the action. Now, muscles have different shapes depending on which we need. Sometimes the fascicles are arranged in rings. And these tend to be sphincters. These tend to close off holes. So, like orbicularis oris means it goes around the mouth. Orbicularis oculi goes around your eye. Some are like triangular, and the fascicles all converge towards the single insertion. So the pectoralis major is a convergent type. Some of them are parallel. So it's a strap type muscle. So all the fascicles are really long and they're parallel. So we get a lot of movement out of these, but not much strength. An example would be the sartorius. If we want more strength, we need more fascicles. So they end up being fat in the middle. So these are fusiform. So they're kind of shaped, tapered at both ends. The biceps brachii falls into this category. Some muscles have like a central tendon, and the fascicles are all short and they attach obliquely, and they look like a feather. Pennant means feather. So you can have pennant on one side, which would be unipennant, and pennant on both sides, which would be bipennant. Or you can even have multi-pennant looks. So when we look at them, circular closes up the hole. Convergent, big, broad origin, converging on a small insertion. Parallel, big, long, so lots of movement. If it's this long and it gets 20% shorter or 40% shorter, you get a lot of movement, but not a lot of strength because there's not a lot of fibers. Unipennant and bipennant and multipennant create a lot of force, but not very much movement because each fascicle is very short. So it only gets maximum 40% shorter. It creates a lot of force because there's a lot of fascicles, but not much movement because the fascicles are short. Fusiform is somehow in between this. That there's a fair length of change and a fair amount of force because there's more fascicles, and the fascicles are long. So by looking at what a muscle looks like, you can surmise how it gets used. Now, muscles work on bones, and so really they're levers. And we have to come to understand how leverage works. So there's basically a couple of ways that levers work, but they all revolve around the same three components. There is the rigid bar, the lever itself, that moves on a fulcrum. Now, in the case of the body, fulcrum is the joint. The effort is the force that's applied to the lever, and that's supplied by muscle contraction. So the point that the muscle attaches to the bone is the point of effort. The load is the resistance. It's any weight that's moved by the effort. And we're going to arrange these three components in three different ways for very specific reasons. So, but all of these things have the same principle, and that is the amount of force at the effort times the distance from the effort to the fulcrum equals the distance from the fulcrum to the load times the force at the load. So this is 25 centimeters. This is 0.25 centimeters. It is 10 times further, or 100 times further, rather. So 10 times 25 is 1,000 times 0.25. So they both equal 250. 10 times 25 is 250. 1,000 times 0.25 is 250. So 10 pounds of force at this end of the lever equals 1,000 pounds of force, or in this case kilograms of force, at this end of the lever. And this is called a power lever. And we call this mechanical advantage. We use mechanical advantage so that it takes less effort to move the load. Now, the trade-off is that we have to move the effort a long way to get a little bit of movement of the load. And that's why you have to move the handle of the jack so far to raise the load up one click on the jack. Now, so this is mechanical advantage. Mechanical disadvantage is when you want speed. And that's when the distance from the effort to the fulcrum is less than the distance of the load to the fulcrum. So it still equals the same. So you use 100 kilograms of effort, 25 centimeters from the fulcrum, and you get to move 50 kilograms of load 50 centimeters from the fulcrum. So you have a mechanical disadvantage. But what you get, in fact, is speed, because your hand, the effort hand, moves less than the load. So the load moves further in the same amount of time, so therefore it moves faster. Now, the way we arrange effort and load and fulcrum gives us the different classes of lever. First class levers, the fulcrum is between the load and effort, and could be either mechanical advantage or mechanical disadvantage. Teeter-totters are this. If you go play teeter-totter with a little kid, and you put the little kid out at the end of the teeter-totter, for you to balance and play with them you have to sit close here to balance it out. If you sit way down at the end, the kid will go up and you'll never go up. But if you sit about there, so if the kid weighs half of what you do, then you have to sit twice as close to the fulcrum as they do in order to balance, in order to play teeter-totter. We use this all the time in scissors. Scissors, the fulcrum's in the middle, the effort is at the handles, and the load is out where you're cutting. Every kid in kindergarten knows that if you're having trouble cutting, move the paper closer into here, closer to the fulcrum, and move your hands further out on the handles, and you will get more mechanical advantage, and you will be much more successful in cutting. An example of where we see this in the body is in the skull. The fulcrum is where the atlas and the occiput meet. The load is the weight of your face, and the effort is the muscles to the occiput, to the back of your skull. And by pulling down, then we lift up our face. Typical first-class lever. Second-class levers are the load is between the fulcrum and effort. Now, the thing about second-class levers is this. So the wheelbarrow is a classic example of this. So the effort is further up, the load is closer. So the distance from the fulcrum to the load is less than the distance from effort to load. So therefore, it takes less effort to move the load. So you lift the handle back here 10 centimeters to lift this load 5 centimeters. And you all know that when you're using a wheelbarrow and it's really heavy, what do? You shift the load to the front of the wheelbarrow, closer to the fulcrum, and you move your hands to the very back of the handles, and you get to lift the leg of the wheelbarrow slightly off the ground. And by lifting this a long way, you lift this a short way. So this is all mechanical advantage. In a second-class lever, you can never have a speed lever because, by definition, the load is closer to the fulcrum than the effort. An example of a second-class lever is the muscles of the calf lifting you up on the ball of your foot. The fulcrum is the ball of your foot. The muscles is the effort. The load is your body weight. The third-class lever, the effort is between the fulcrum and load. So this is a pair of tongs or tweezers. It looks like this. This is chopsticks. And so the fulcrum is back here, effort is applied between, and the load is out here. What you get is a lot of movement out here for very little movement in the effort. However, you can't create as much force out here. Which would you rather have your thumb squeezed by? A pair of pliers, which is a first-class lever with mechanical advantage, or a pair of tongs, which is a third-class lever with mechanical disadvantage? When they shear sheep, sheep shears are not scissors. They are things that look like sharpened tongs. And that's because they can get a lot of fleece with very little movement of the fingers. And they don't generate enough force to actually cut the sheep's skin, just enough to cut the fleece. Yeah, you can pick things up with tongs or chopsticks. You can grab a lot because you get a lot of movement for at the load for very little movement at the effort, but you can't really grip it really strongly. And that's why people that are learning to use chopsticks get frustrated, because they can't seem to develop the strength. So an example of this would be where the biceps go to the radius. The load is way out here, the effort's here. You get a lot of movement for a very little bit of shortening here. It takes a lot of effort to move the load, though. So that's kind of a very brief overview of leverage. Now, when we look at muscles, if we were doing this in depth, we would look at the name and description of the muscle, the attachments, the point of attachments, origin, insertion, and the action of the muscle, and the major nerve that supplies it. There are a lot of professions that need to use this: massage therapy, physiotherapy, etc. All the therapies tend to know this a lot. They spend a lot of time learning this. For our purposes, we're just going to very superficially look at it. And we're not going to talk about innervation, or even, for that matter, action or origin and insertion. We don't know the names of all the bumps on the bones. So for our purposes, you're going to need to be able to identify off a diagram these muscles. These are the superficial muscles. They're the muscles we landmark. These are the muscles that you can see through the skin. And so these are the muscles that we're going to have you responsible for. So, so this is from the front, and this one's from the back. I'm not going to go through them here because they're all self-explanatory. Remember some of the naming conventions. So sternocleidomastoid, epicranius, on top of the cranium, deltoid, triangular shape, teres major, the big one that's cylindrical shape, latissimus dorsi, latitude, plate, it's flat, gluteus maximus, adductor magnus, so that's going to adduct the thigh, biceps femoris, two heads and the femur, etc. Okay, so responsible for this one and this one.